Ahora entonces, tal él lo anunció, vamos a pasar al panel y va a ser en inglés, Global Trends about Free Expression and Media Development. And I will allow myself to introduce the speakers that we are going to have with us. And after that, our good friend, Guilherme Canelas, will assume the panel and be the moderator for this panel. With us today, we have Anya Schiffrin. She's the Director of Technology, Media, and Communications at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, and a lecturer who teaches on global media innovation and human rights. She writes on journalism and development investigative reporting in the Global South and has published extensively over the last decade on the media in Africa. More recently, she has become focused on solutions to the problem of online disinformation, earning her PhD on the topic from the University of Navarra. Also with us is Antonia Carroll. Is a research manager, technology, media, and education at Economist, London. Before, she worked as senior consultant research and eminence lead at Deloitte in Chicago, Illinois. She served as university instructor in the Peace Corps in Dazhou, China, for 2 years, and later was an associate intern with IBM in New York. She graduated with honors in sociology at Beer Moore College in Pennsylvania. She's a Master of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell University. Her research has been featured in Reuters, Forbes, Chronicle of Higher Education, and the World Economic Forum, among others. And also, I have the pleasure to introduce Guilherme, our good friend, Guilherme Canelas de Souza Godoi, is chief of the section of freedom of expression and safety of journalism at UNESCO. He holds a degree in international relations from the University of Brasilia and a master's degree in political science from the University of Sao Paulo. Previously, he worked at UNESCO office in Montevideo, Uruguay. He coordinated the media and journalism research area of the news agencies for children's rights. Guilherme, we have around an hour and 10 minutes for this panel. Thank you very much for being a speaker and also a moderator on this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you, good friends that I haven't seen for a long time now. So I'm glad to see old faces and new faces, but also it's, as you can imagine, a super great pleasure to moderate Antonia and Anya. So my work obviously is very easy here because those two are the real stars here in this story. So Anya and Antonia, if you don't mind, I will speak in Spanish because at least I can have some opportunities to not speak in English all the time. Entonces paso al español. Como vieron, no tengo una ventana como mi jefe tiene, aunque por acá puedo ver que el cielo en París está bastante agradable. Es un placer para la UNESCO poder seguir participando de estas asambleas de la CIP, particularmente para poder, como dijo el director general adjunto, discutir con ustedes estas tendencias sobre los temas de libertad de expresión en general, libertad de prensa en particular, tendencias que desafortunadamente en este momento no son nada buenas en distintos frentes, incluyendo en el frente de viabilidad de los medios que vamos a subrayar de manera más específica hoy, pero si vemos lo que está pasando en este momento en Europa, en Ucrania, vemos que las tendencias globales también para temas clave como seguridad periodistas son complejas. La situación en América Latina en general, en México en particular, sobre seguridad periodistas también son complejas. Entonces, yo lo que voy a hacer ahora muy brevemente en el comienzo, ya que Anya y Antonia van a hablar de manera más específica sobre la cuestión de viabilidad de los medios, voy a hacer un rápido recorrido con ustedes sobre las principales conclusiones de este informe global que la UNESCO apenas ha lanzado hace menos de un mes, este informe sobre tendencias globales de libertad de expresión y desarrollo de los medios, que uno de los temas clave es justamente el tema de la viabilidad de los medios. Estamos haciendo hincapié en esta idea de información como un bien público, pero en particular, en el caso de este informe, hemos trabajado la idea más específica del periodismo como un bien público, y en este contexto, derivado de la declaración de Windhoek más 30, como mencionó ya el ADG, hemos reforzado una serie de conceptos y de ángulos y perspectivas de esta idea del periodismo como un bien público, que opera como una continuidad de la declaración original de Windhoek, que hacía hincapié en estos tres grandes componentes de los medios, que los medios deben ser libres, independientes y plurales. Entonces, este informe de la UNESCO que publicamos una vez cada 4 años, busca justamente ofrecer o lanzar luces y ofrecer datos que buscan poner en discusión estas tres grandes características: la independencia, la pluralidad y la libertad de los medios, ¿no? Entonces, muy rápidamente voy a pasar por ahí. Y ahí vamos a, cuando concluya, voy a pasar la pelota a Antonia, que va a hablar de una investigación en particular que desarrolló de manera independiente The Economist Impact, comisionada por la UNESCO, sobre estas características más particulares del fenómeno de la viabilidad de los medios. Y después Anya va a hablar de una cosa que nos parece fundamental. En este escenario tan complejo, ¿cuáles son algunas de las soluciones que podemos buscar en términos de políticas públicas? Entonces, este es el recorrido que vamos a hacer. Vamos a intentar ser lo más breve posible para abrir para las preguntas y respuestas de ustedes, ¿no? Entonces, este es, como mencionaba, es el informe que publicamos normalmente una vez cada 4 años. Hay un breve video con varias personas, incluyendo Anya acá, que han comentado elementos claves de esta discusión de la UNESCO. Vamos a ver si eso funciona. Si sí, escuchemos el video y ya regreso yo, ¿no?
When you're covering humanitarian crisis, journalistic information is often a matter of life and death.
Between 2010 and 2019, close to 900 journalists were killed because they're journalists.
Around the world, COVID pandemic gave an excuse to crack down on press freedom.
Journalism doesn't have the revenues that it needs to do the kind of serious journalism, investigative reporting that is necessary.
Lies, laced with anger and hate, spread faster and further than facts.
Y reportes como el reporte de UNESCO ponen la lupa en el lugar que corresponde. Muestran que lo que puede parecer normal en una sociedad que no protege la libertad de expresión, en realidad no es normal.
We can be optimistic about the future of journalism because more and more people are realizing how important it is.
Entonces, o sea, eso es un poco lo que ustedes van a encontrar en este informe, que es bastante completo, y después voy a poner acá en el chat el enlace. Hemos producido toda una base de datos interactiva que ustedes pueden jugar con varios de estos elementos que al final contribuyeron para hacer esta discusión del periodismo como un bien público. Pero para construir este informe, lo que hemos hecho a lo largo de los 4 años que llevan desde la publicación del anterior hasta este, fue comisionar una serie de documentos de políticas públicas, policy briefs, que han lanzado luces sobre varios aspectos de esta discusión. Por ejemplo, ustedes están viendo ahí uno sobre la seguridad de corresponsales extranjeros, otro sobre la transparencia de las empresas de Internet, otro sobre la seguridad de los periodistas que cubren protestas sociales, el tema del periodismo, libertad de expresión en el contexto de la pandemia, los temas de acceso a la información pública, etc. Entonces, y ahora lo que Anya va a discutir, que es uno que estamos haciendo acá con ustedes, un preview, vamos a lanzar durante el Día Mundial de Libertad de Prensa en Uruguay, en Punta del Este, un informe especial sobre la viabilidad de los medios, que la autora es Anya, pero vamos acá a estar haciendo un break news para ustedes con los principales elementos de este informe. Entonces, acá algunas de las estadísticas que ustedes van a encontrar en este informe mundial. 85% de la población mundial ha experienciado un declinio en sus condiciones generales de libertad de expresión, libertad de prensa en los últimos 5 años. Eso es muy fuerte, ¿no? O sea, en un periodo de 5 años, que tengamos que 85% de la población ha vivenciado algún tipo de downsize en materia de libertad de expresión, libertad de prensa, es algo que todo el sistema de Naciones Unidas y UNESCO en particular están mirando con gran preocupación. Hay buenas noticias también en este mar de malas noticias, ¿no? O sea, cuando aprobamos la primera declaración de Binduk en 1991, teníamos solo 12 países en el planeta con leyes de acceso a la información pública. Hoy tenemos 132 países con ley de acceso a la información pública. Entonces, bueno, nuestro desafío es un poco cómo luchamos contra las tendencias negativas que estamos observando, pero también cómo reforzamos lo que hay de positivo en este escenario global en relación a la libertad de expresión y acceso a la información pública. Como el ADG ha mencionado, y eso viene del informe que ha preparado la Economist comisionado por la UNESCO, 50% hay un drop, hay una caída de 50% en las recetas de la industria del advertisement para la industria de newspapers. Por ahí Antonia va a entrar en mucho más detalles con ustedes sobre estas cuestiones. Acá es solo un snapshot de todo eso. También en los últimos 5 años del informe hemos contabilizado desafortunadamente el asesinato de 455 periodistas, lo que refuerza que tenemos viejos y nuevos desafíos en materia de proteger y promover la libertad de expresión. Hemos trabajado las varias discusiones y los varios ángulos en relación a la libertad de expresión. Uno de ellos que la directora general adjunto mencionó es cómo viene el tema de la libertad de expresión en línea. Entonces, bueno, hay temas generales, como he mencionado, ¿no? Como la población general tiene una percepción sobre lo que está pasando con libertad de expresión, pero hay cosas muy concretas, como por ejemplo, en el periodo del informe hemos contabilizado 57 propuestas legislativas que han sido aprobadas en más de 44 países que reducen el espectro de la libertad de expresión al revés de ampliar el espectro de la libertad de expresión. Aunque hemos tenido para el año pasado, cuando cerramos el informe, y desafortunadamente este año la tendencia por lo que está pasando en México, por lo que lo que está pasando en Ucrania, desafortunadamente parece que va a revertirse, pero hasta el año pasado estábamos monitoreando, como ustedes pueden ver por la gráfica, una caída en los asesinatos de los y las periodistas, lo que, claro, es una buena noticia. Sin embargo, al mismo tiempo, hemos observado un aumento de las prisiones de periodistas, o sea, del encarcelamiento de periodistas, utilizándolo básicamente leyes de calumnia y difamación y otros tipos de legislación que son absolutamente en contra del sistema universal de derechos humanos. No voy a detenerme mucho en los elementos de la viabilidad de los medios y en particular los datos que demuestran lo que está pasando, porque eso lo va a llevar con más detalle Antonia y no quiero tomar su tiempo, pero esto es solo para que sepan que es parte del informe global de la UNESCO. Y por eso la UNESCO viene trabajando un conjunto de actividades relacionadas al tema de la viabilidad. Una de ellas es particularmente este conjunto de propuestas de políticas públicas que Anya va a discutir con ustedes en un ratito más. Nosotros, en el marco de la declaración de Binduk más 30, hemos discutido y afortunadamente el tema fue aprobado por los 193 Estados miembros de la UNESCO, que hay tres grandes elementos acá que tenemos que poner más atención, incluyendo desde el punto de vista de las políticas públicas. Uno es el tema de la viabilidad de los medios, siempre y cuando las estrategias garanticen la independencia editorial de los medios. El otro tema es el tema de la alfabetización mediática e informacional, que es fundamental para empoderar a la ciudadanía en una relación más crítica con el ecosistema digital. Y finalmente la idea de la reforma legal y regulatoria, lo que incluye el tema de la transparencia de las empresas de Internet y mejorar la accountability de estas empresas vis-a-vis la Agenda Global de Derechos Humanos. Entonces yo paro por acá, era para darles una mirada de vuelo de pájaro de lo que pueden encontrar en este informe global de la UNESCO. Y ahora con mucho placer voy a utilizar mi otro sombrero acá de moderador y paso la palabra a Antonia. Como Ricardo ha mencionado, Antonia es una gran aliada de la UNESCO en estas discusiones. Hemos trabajado ya desde hace un año en este informe que la UNESCO ha comisionado a lo que era entonces la The Economist Intelligence Unit y ahora se llama The Economist Impact. Y ellos de manera independiente produjeron un informe que también estamos lanzando la versión final de manera casi que inédita acá para ustedes. La versión subió a internet durante ahora los feriados de Pascua. Entonces, Antonia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Guilherme. I wish I spoke Spanish or really any other language fluently, so I'm very impressed. I'm guessing everybody can see my screen right now. So I wanted to thank all of you as well for having me here to speak today. And I'm really excited to share some of the key findings from a recent report that, as Guilherme said, came out just last Thursday. And I'll also share the link to that report in the chat at the end of the presentation, so you can all take a look as well. And as Guilherme said, UNESCO came to us about a year ago with the goal of trying to answer this question, which is, what has been the economic impact of COVID-19 on the global news media industry? Is it something that would actually be called a quote unquote extinction level event? And what are different initiatives that countries are engaging in, or even individual news media outlets, to try and address some of the challenges that COVID-19 has caused? So we set out to collect as much data as we possibly could to try and answer this question. And you can see here that we broadly focused on 10 countries in 4 regions, primarily within the global South, although wherever possible, we tried to collect data at a more kind of global level as well. And we found, and this will come as no surprise to anyone on this call, that COVID-19 has really accelerated the decline of news outlets' most profitable revenue stream, primarily print advertising and circulation, by about 3 years. So as Guilherme mentioned, print revenues have slumped by 13% in 2020 alone, which is the largest single decline since 2016. And something that's really important here is that, the pace of change in the global South was almost 2.5 times faster than the global average. So outlets in the 10 countries that we were looking at, as well as other countries within those global data sets, were facing a particularly challenging environment. And it's important also to note that we don't actually anticipate a return to pre-COVID levels in the following years, even though there will be a slight uptick, and you can see here in 2021 that there is a small increase, but we will never go back to the time pre-COVID. So why has this happened, or why was COVID-19, such an intensifier of the issues that the news media industry is facing? The first is around this question of advertising. And again, this will come as no surprise to anyone on this call that, print advertising revenues have been in decline for a while, but 2020 was almost like a tipping point year. And that was the largest single decline in print advertising revenue since 2009. But almost more importantly, it was also this tipping point into the world of internet advertising, where for the first time, internet advertising made up over 50% of all global ad spend. And you can see these trends here in the graph on the left-hand side. So we estimate that as much as $10 billion will be lost from print to internet advertising by 2025. And the majority of that money is going to go to social media platforms. And you can see here in 2009, they made up just 4% of the digital advertising expenditure. And they're estimated to make up to almost 40% by 2023. And this is followed closely by other, other sources such as Google or even Amazon, which is whose advertising business is really kind of going from strength to strength as well. So it wasn't all doom and gloom. So we saw also quite a rapid increase in digital news revenues. But the issue really is that at this point, and even in the next, in the short to medium term, that growth is just not going to be enough to offset losses in print. So we expect digital news revenue to grow by about $5 billion from $16 billion in 2019 to $21 billion in 2025. But that really is a drop in the bucket compared to the $20 billion loss in print revenue that will happen during that same time period. So there's about $15 billion that is basically now lost, and that news outlets are going to have to figure out what to do without that revenue. And while we found that there are some opportunities for growth, to a large extent, a lot of outlets haven't really figured out how best to monetize them. And we talk about this at The Economist a lot as well. So podcasts, are an area where we saw a lot of strong growth, actually, the most of almost any other type of product. And so there is an expectation that that could be up to 1.5 billion monthly users by 2024. But really seeing this sort of return on podcast advertising to make up for those losses in print. A lot of outlets haven't yet quite figured out how best to do that. And again, it's really, at this point, looks like a drop in the bucket compared to some of those print revenue losses. And I think this sort of third challenge, or the third reason behind this accelerated decline of the news media industry, is that outlets are really operating in an increasingly challenging business and political environment. And while we didn't really go into some of the sort of political challenges that Guilherme mentioned for this particular project, there is very little support, whether it's from philanthropic donors, governments, or even in the form of private investment for news media outlets around the world. So here is some data that we found about the volume or the value of philanthropic donations to news media outlets or to journalists. And you can see that in 2020, there was certainly an uptick in the amount of money that was available to journalists from philanthropic donors. However, there are two issues with this. One, it disproportionately is available to news media outlets in the US. So for many countries in the global South that are struggling, that money is just not available. And again, these figures are just not even remotely coming close to what would be needed to ensure media viability at a large scale. And on the government support side, so we also looked at the availability of COVID-19 stimulus money for news media outlets. And when we were looking into this, we focused only on the 10 countries that I showed you earlier. And interestingly, Indonesia was the only country of that group where there was an explicit reference to news media organizations in their COVID-19 stimulus package. But Senegal and Nigeria were two other countries where there was some mention of creative industries or cultural industry sectors that news media organizations could have taken advantage of. But I think the main point here is that, without an explicit provision, there's really sort of a lack of understanding about how much money is actually available, and B, maybe outlets may have not been able to take advantage of what funding was in place, which certainly didn't help at a time of really severe economic pressure. So I wanted to dive in, given the audience here today, a little bit into some of our findings specific to Latin America. And we, in the report, we sort of look at these global trends that I just mentioned, and then we do some comparison by region. And by and large, I would say that the global trends that I mentioned, the decline in print revenue, the increase in digital, that story plays out fairly similarly in different regions around the world. But there are some really important nuances. And it may come to no surprise to anyone on this call that, of the regions that suffered the most, Latin America was certainly one of them. And that this sort of transition to digital, there will be a greater struggle in this region compared to some of the others that we saw. And I can explain that in more detail in a minute. So you'll see that here in Latin America, print revenues declined by 14% in 2020 compared to 13% globally, which isn't a huge difference. But what this actually represents is an acceleration in the decline of print revenues of over 5 years. So if we have a global average of 3-year accelerated decline, in Latin America, that is 5 years. So things are moving much faster. One thing that's really interesting in Latin America is that while digital revenue is growing, actually at quite a fast pace, it's not going to be enough to cover the loss of print revenue, and in fact is probably covers the least amount of print revenue loss of any region that we looked at. So new digital revenue in Latin America is expected to cover just 9% of the loss of print revenue by 2025. And we compare that to almost 30% in North America, 28% in Western Europe, and even in Sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, I think that number hovers in the mid-teens, so around 17%. So, so there's a big gap for news media outlets in Latin America in particular. And in some, in the example of podcasts, again, which is an area of potential growth for a lot of news media organizations, outlets in Latin America are not projected to see some of the same benefits that others in North America, for example, might be. So here you can see that just 3% of global advertising revenue from podcasts is expected to go to Latin America, which is far lower than that for North America or Western Europe. And there's also very little government or philanthropic support available to news outlets in Latin America. And this is particularly the case in some of the smaller markets. So I won't go into a ton of detail here. I would say from the support of the internet company's standpoint, there's been some philanthropic donations available to outlets in El Salvador and Brazil. But you can see, for example, in the case of Brazil, that while there is some money available, which is fantastic, the amount of money that is available really, again, isn't going to be enough to offset some of these losses in print advertising and circulation revenue. What's also really interesting, and is something hopefully I'll get to touch on a bit in the Q&A, is that data availability was a real challenge that we faced in this program. And so particularly when it comes to El Salvador and Jamaica, there may well be more activity going on there that we weren't able to uncover. But I think in those markets and in smaller markets in general, the lack of data made it also really difficult to evaluate the scope of the challenges on the ground. And you can see that even here. So I think that there are kind of 3 main takeaways here. So, we know that the overall health of the news industry has been in decline for a while, and that COVID-19 has really accelerated those trends. A lack of access to capital, whether it's investment, government, or philanthropy, it just makes it very difficult for most news media outlets to innovate out of this crisis, particularly in the current market that we're in. And that some urgent action is really needed, whether it's at the outlet level in terms of finding new sources of revenue, taking advantage of new technologies, or more at the macro level, whether it's in the form of government policies or international assistance, or other sources of revenue in that format. So as I mentioned, this more detail can be found in our report, which launched last week. So we go into a lot more detail around industry trends and forecasts. We also have a large data workbook, which we will also put online that will be available for all of you to take a look at, which is the sort of source data for the entire report. And we also have 10 country case studies that are included in this report that go into a bit more detail than I have here on what some of the sort of national initiatives are around supporting news media outlets. And with that, I will hand over to Anya. Thank you all very much.
You're muted, Anya.
Gracias. Hola, buenas. Voy a intentar compartir mi screen y disculpe que mi castellano no llega a una presentación de mucho tiempo. Me defiendo, pero no sé si vas a sufrir. Ok, muy bien. Entonces, yo trabajé en este brief que fue commissioned by UNESCO y también hice otro documento para Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, which goes more into detail about many of the points that Antonia mentioned in Canada and Indonesia and some other countries. What our intention was to help governments and policymakers and the industry come up with ideas for how to help journalism. And the good news is that there are many solutions that are being tried out all over the world. We took some of the very interesting research that Antonia and her team came up with, and we wrote in more detail about that. So I don't have enough time to really go into everything, but this PowerPoint can be shared with anyone who wants. There's our UNESCO brief. I'm sure someone will put the link in the chat. And then also this report for Konrad Adenauer is called Saving Journalism. So we've now got a lot of information about the solutions that are out there. What we found were really four main areas, and I used a taxonomy provided by Nishant Lalwani, and I'm just going to go over some of the trends that we saw. So one intervention is more funding, including philanthropy, and clearly Google and Facebook provided some more funding. As always, there's the quest for new business models, but I'm clearly worried about that, as is Antonia. And I think it's important, you all know better than I, but the last time I checked, advertising revenue rose in line with consumer spending, which goes in line with GDP economic growth. So the last time I looked, the percentage of spending on advertising as a percentage of GDP hadn't really changed in about 120 years. So what this means to me, and I'll be interested to know what the news publishers in the audience think, is that it's a zero-sum game. The advertising spend that is lost by traditional outlets goes to Facebook and Google. The idea that there's going to suddenly be way more advertising revenue and that the pie will grow, I don't think really holds up. So when we think about new business models, that really means other kinds of activities, as Antonia alluded to, the events, the podcasts, the membership, that kind of thing, which is what everybody's moved to. I think tax on tech is obviously essential. And there's also a role for public subsidy and the role of government. And we're seeing that increase in several places. So we can talk in more detail about some of this if possible. I think that the crisis that Antonia alludes to meant that philanthropists in many countries decided they really had to do something to help journalism. In the US, this meant a lot of emphasis on local news and outlets owned by people of color. And what we heard in the global South is this is just not enough money. So, in South Africa, Daily Maverick co-founder said, we need $1 billion a year to save journalism. And if we, and unless we save journalism, we can't save democracy. So, Google, by contrast, I think the Google News Emergency Fund gave a few million. The Innovation Fund gave 150 million in Europe, but that's just not near what we need. And don't forget that Google gives funding in places where they're about to be regulated. So there's been plenty of documentation about how the funding to journalism ends up being, it's part of their public relations exercise. And it's the same with Facebook. It's not the substantive systemic funding that we need. The International Fund for Public Interest Media was aimed at helping reporting in the Global South. And Maria Ressa and Mark Thompson have been named as CEO. They've announced a 30 million donation from USAID. They were hoping, I think, originally to get hundreds of millions. So let's hope that happens. Again, I can talk more about that. They would be an intermediary organization. I expect they're going to announce major funding from Google and Facebook fairly soon. Now, as we know, that even though it's the philanthropists have stepped up, there's obviously a thing that, there's lots of reasons to worry about that, right? So it can restrict journalist autonomy, can create a reliance on grants, doesn't necessarily enable sustainable growth, although many of the foundations are trying to fund new business models for people to pilot. And again, as I mentioned, Google and Facebook are now very influential as funders, and they don't follow the practices of traditional philanthropists. So that can be a worrisome problem too. There's more sort of publishers in the room and experienced people than, I've only run a very small newspaper years ago in Istanbul, so I'm not an expert, but clearly two of the ways that you can really survive are developing a niche if you're a startup, and have a team that really understands business and markets. And this is a point often made by Janine Warner from Semper Medio, or do a huge story that really shakes the world, like the Panama Papers and the ICIJ. Otherwise, small outlets really need, lots of funding in order to scale. And that's just, as Antonia pointed out, not usually open to that. The MDIF has announced $1 million investment fund for early stage independent companies. And they're trying, so that's one of the new initiatives. But I think that probably the biggest news has been the implementation last year of Australia News Media Bargaining Code. And that was a really big deal because this was not the usual attempt to get Google and Facebook to pay for news by using copyright law, which you remember Spain had tried, Germany and France had tried, and the companies had kind of refused. What Australia said, this was the competition commissioner, was that Google and Facebook have to negotiate with the publishers. And if they can't come to an agreement, they have to go to arbitration, the government appointed mediator. And they have to do what we call baseball arbitration or final offer arbitration. And what that means is that you come in with your very best offer. So it makes things much faster and more efficient than coming in really far apart. Now, when this got started, Google and Facebook, when this was proposed, did a massive lobbying effort. They threatened to cut Australia off from global news. And in fact, I think they actually did cut off Australia from Facebook for a couple of days. And a lot of outlets said, this isn't good. This is really just a gift to Rupert Murdoch because it was put in under a conservative government. But now, a year later, what we're finding is that about $200 million were transferred from Google and Facebook to journalism. And a lot of the outlets are now hiring. So this was a really significant amount of money. And Canada has just announced its own version. And Canada's made a number of improvements. So with there being Google and Facebook under the Australian agreement don't have to say how much money they're giving. So that's been very worrisome. But in fact, in Canada, there is more transparency. So they do have to say that. There's also the Canadians have been have very detailed sort of designations of what counts as quality news outlets. And they've expanded all kinds of tax credits and tax support for news as well. So the Canada example is a really interesting example. And it shows how when you do have government policies, you can iterate and improve them over time. My understanding is that Brazil was actually considering a similar law, but that Google and Facebook managed to reach Bolsonaro and killed it just a few days ago. It's a Brazilian journalist, Patricia Campos de Meio, who's been filling me in on all of this. And I've asked her to try to write something, hopefully for Pointer, detailing what's happened. But I think that this was a encouraging development and an example that other countries may want to look at. In the US, for example, there's always been a lot of concern about the idea of government support for journalism, but because people are so desperate, there's now much more initiative. So tax credits, there were 3 kinds of tax credits for journalism that were in the Build Back Better bill. What we found in our research was that in many countries in the global South, people were afraid of government support. So we kept hearing this over and over again from reporters in Latin America. They would say, we're not Sweden. You can't trust our government. You know, this could, if we get tax credits from the government, then that means they've got a list of what's acceptable, and that could jeopardize our freedom. It'll erode our brand. You know, we might end up having to give kickbacks. So in Latin America, we heard a lot of skepticism about the idea of government support. But as Antonia mentioned, the idea of tax credits has been spreading in different countries. And these can be many, different forms. So credits for outlets that hire new reporters, credits for advertisers who are advertising in outlets, vouchers to be given to new subscribers, waiving taxes on VAT. So there's a lot of different ideas that are being tried. And economists argue that tax credits may not be the ideal solution from a fiscal perspective. What would be the best would be if companies like Google and Facebook actually pay Amazon, actually pay taxes, because they're huge tax avoiders. That money should go to the government, and then there should be support out of a general fund. What you don't want is what we've seen in some places, which is Google and Facebook directly funding media outlets. That's obviously pretty worrisome. So a tax on tech would obviously be the best idea. But as I mentioned, there is some skepticism. And then I'm just looking to see how much time I have here. I'm almost out of time, but we have more detail on what the Indonesian Press Council did and how the tax cuts worked in Indonesia. What happened was Antonia mentioned this in a call, and I thought it was so interesting that I got one of my students to research. So we've now got a whole case study on what Indonesia did. And they gave income tax relief, they decreased the corporate tax, they suspended electricity charges, and they abolished VAT for newsprint. They also paid journalists to write stories about COVID and health practices. The conclusion of my student was that this worked incredibly well for a lot of reasons. One was that there was a very well organized council of editors. So it was very targeted and it was short in duration. So the fear, there was obviously a lot of worry about subsidizing coverage of health, but the fears so far have not been, realized. But anyway, you can read more about it if you're interested. As you would expect, France obviously passed gave lots of help to journalism outlets in France. It was about 483 million euros, again, tax credits, lots of innovation funds, Canadian federal government as well. They created something called the Registered Journalism Organization, which has been a little bit controversial. So anyway, point being that Africa was very disappointing. Very few public subsidies, little financial support. I'm going to wrap up and just say the main thing is that it's exciting. There's a lot of good ideas out there. People are trying new things. They're expanding projects that work. There's an openness to taking government funding and to new ways of doing things that we didn't see before. There's obviously plenty of risks. And I think the main thing we have to remember as well is the point made by Guilherme that even though financial support is really important for quality journalism and information, so is freedom of expression. And without that, we're basically lost. Like many people on the Zoom, I do think that democracy is at stake. If we don't have a vibrant media holding government and corporates to account, then we're basically in trouble. It's so clear that journalists have been on the front line for the last few years during the periods of authoritarianism, covering the human rights violations and all the terrible problems. The pandemic strained people. We were just launching our UNESCO report at Perugia last week at the International Journalism Festival, and it was clear that people are exhausted. Folks have put in a huge amount of time and effort, and they're in danger. They're getting cyber harassed. They're, journalists in India and Brazil have faced incredible threats, and it's a real moment of desperation in the profession. So the time is to act now. And there's lots of things that can be done. And if you're a government representative on this call and you're not ready to do something big like a major subsidy or a major tax credit, you can at least set up as a first step, you can set up a commission to look into the problem. A number of countries have done this. This is one of the UNESCO recommendations from Guy Berger. But I would say it's an emergency, and it's really important to support journalism now more than ever. So I'll stop here. Muchísimas gracias y estoy dispuesto a responder a las preguntas.
Thank you, Anya. Thank you, Antonia. We have a good 26 minutes for this interaction. I do have some questions myself as moderator, but since I have the privilege to talk a lot with Antonia and Anya, I will prefer to open the floor to you guys. I saw that Ricardo said to add the questions in the Q&A, but I also guess is authorized to the raise hands and asking the questions directly, right, Ricardo?
Así es, así es. Si quieres puedo, si me permites, tengo dos preguntas.
Por favor, adelante.
Por un lado, si la UNESCO, a continuidad de lo que ha expresado Anya especialmente y también Antonia, va a dar seguimiento a este tema de Australia, la buena exposición que se hace con la ley en Canadá, que aplica mayor transparencia, como lo has dicho vos al principio, sobre el tema de las negociaciones, que no son tan transparentes tal vez en Australia, y lo que está pasando en Europa, y Anya dijo muy bien, el tema de Brasil, con la nueva ley que no ha pasado, que fue controversial y que seguramente se despedazará en varios pedazos para mantener el tema de la sostenibilidad por un lado y lo otro. Entonces, si este estudio va a dar continuidad a todos estos nuevos elementos. Es la primera pregunta. La segunda tiene que ver con algo que explicaste vos de lo positivo. Hablas o te referiste, y la UNESCO lo encuentra, que son 132 países con leyes de acceso. En América Latina, más de 20 países ya tenemos con leyes de acceso, lo que es gran satisfacción a lo que fue una década atrás. Sin embargo, estamos notando que estas leyes de acceso son parte de la demagogia gubernamental, porque las trabas subsisten. En los informes que ayer vimos, prácticamente uno de los problemas mayores, tanto en Estados Unidos, Canadá, como toda América Latina, el Caribe, Brasil, etc., es que hay leyes, pero no tienen dientes. Es decir, los periodistas siguen teniendo, y los ciudadanos, problemas para ingresar a buscar información, accesar información de interés público, ¿no? Entonces, si esto es también algo que se ve en todos los demás países en general, o si hay algún país en particular que esté demostrando que una ley de acceso realmente en vigencia está siendo utilizada de la mejor forma posible.
Gracias. So maybe Antonia and Anya, if you don't mind, I will just get to the initial part of the questions related to UNESCO and then over to you. Sobre el trabajo de la UNESCO en general en relación al tema de viabilidad de los medios, afortunadamente desde un punto de vista de política multilateral en el sistema Naciones Unidas, como nuestros Estados miembros, como ustedes saben, somos un club de 193 países, han aprobado la declaración de Windhoek más 30, que tiene instrucciones muy claras en términos de principios al secretariado de la UNESCO, o sea, nosotros que somos los servidores civiles internacionales que tenemos que implementar el mandato que nos dan los Estados miembros. Como los Estados han aprobado esta idea de que ustedes, secretariado, tienen que trabajar más en el tema de viabilidad de los medios, eso es lo que vamos a seguir haciendo. Entonces, los próximos pasos de este trabajo, yo añadí acá en el chat estos distintos documentos, incluyendo este policy brief que Anya apenas presentó. Los próximos pasos son, hemos publicado un texto con buenas prácticas. Larry Kilman, que muchos de ustedes conocen porque trabajó muchos años en OneIFRA, ha producido un estudio con buenas prácticas de cómo lidiar con este desafío de la viabilidad de los medios en varias partes del mundo. Hemos publicado este estudio en varias lenguas recientemente, incluyendo español, por supuesto. Entonces, eso es una cosa, intentar ver cómo podemos crear más intercambios de conocimiento entre las distintas regiones del mundo sobre lo que se está haciendo. La otra cosa, en términos de implementación de la declaración de Windhoek más 30, es precisamente apoyar desde la UNESCO la implementación de las recomendaciones del documento de política pública que Anya apenas presentó. O sea, ahí hay recomendaciones muy claras, que no voy a repetir lo que ella dijo. Y entonces, desde la UNESCO, como política multilateral, vamos a seguir insistiendo con nuestros Estados miembros que hay que hacer este salto desde un punto de vista de proteger el periodismo como un bien público. El desafío acá, como Anya dijo, es cómo logramos que los gobiernos hagan políticas públicas en esta área y al mismo tiempo mantenga la independencia editorial de los medios. O sea, no es sencillo hacerlo, como ustedes bien saben, ¿no? O sea, plata gubernamental para los medios, si no es bien estructurada con un acabose o un marco institucional muy sólido, tiene muchos riesgos involucrados. Pero desde el punto de vista de la UNESCO, siempre vamos a hacer la sugerencia con todas las salvaguardias necesarias para que eso pueda ocurrir. Y finalmente, la otra cosa es que queremos que las plataformas de Internet sean más transparentes en todo eso, incluyendo sobre estos problemas. La ley canadiense es uno de los ejemplos, etc. Entonces, por ejemplo, ahora, en el Día Mundial de Libertad de Prensa en Punta del Este, incluyendo con la participación de algunos de ustedes, vamos a tener dos sesiones. Una para presentar el policy brief que Anya apenas presentó a ustedes acá en primera mano, pero vamos a tener una otra sesión sobre qué hay que preguntar a las empresas de Internet sobre estas cuestiones. O sea, cuáles son los elementos que pueden hacer con que ellas sean más transparentes. Y ahí, después de eso, UNESCO va a publicar una demanda, unas guías de cómo estas empresas tienen que ser más transparentes en este campo específico de la viabilidad de los medios. Y tu otra pregunta, creo que es un tema para otro seminario, pero voy a hacer la respuesta corta y después podemos seguir offline sobre eso. O sea, es claro que todos sabemos, no solo en la área de libertad de expresión, en cualquier área de políticas públicas, tener una ley no es suficiente para que las cosas cambien. O sea, la ley es una condición necesaria, pero no es una condición necesaria y suficiente para el cambio. Ahora, pero sí es necesario, o sea, el primer paso es tener una ley. Ahora, entonces hay que tener, ahora en los países que tienen la ley, hay que hacer un esfuerzo de implementación. Lo que sí puedo decir es que tenemos datos de que las leyes de acceso a la información pública han cambiado el escenario de la transparencia. Como un tango argentino, hay unos pasos para acá, unos pasos para allá, pero yo sí creo que es un error pensar que todo está mal en este campo. O sea, tenemos muy buenos ejemplos que no son solo anecdóticos, son estructurales, de cambios desde el punto de vista de las políticas de transparencia, sobre todo la transparencia activa, cuando los gobiernos han mejorado voluntariamente la presentación de datos sobre muchas cosas. Entonces, en fin, pero no voy a extenderme acá porque si no eso es tema para otro seminario. Pero I will stop and maybe Anya, I don't know, since the question was very much related to what to do next from the example from Australia and Canada. I don't know if you want to add any inputs to this. I just gave the bureaucratic perspective from UNESCO. You have much more exciting perspectives than I can have. You are muted.
Yeah, I think it's going to be incredibly important for countries to get together and pass this kind of legislation. So that's what I would do. I think you've now got two, examples to look at, and I would very much start pressuring local governments to adopt a Canada type version. In the US, we've got, I think it's called the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, and that allows publishers to band together to negotiate, which normally would be considered, a violation of antitrust law. So remember that when, I think it was Hachette tried to organize publishers to be able to negotiate against the discounting on Amazon, and that did not fly in the United States. But I think it would be incredibly important. Now we've got examples from Australia and Canada to try to copy those examples and to adapt them for your own countries. I think what I heard in some places, from some of the African countries is we're too small. We can't take on Google and Facebook by ourselves. The UN should do it, but I don't think the UN is going to do it. So I think Latin American countries will have to do it. And then I think obviously tax avoidance is, a huge, huge problem. So in as much as people can sign on for global agreements on taxes and then find ways of using some of that money that's collected and given to journalism, I think that's going to be essential. And I know that the tech companies will say, even if, we pay taxes, it wouldn't be enough to save journalism, but it would be a lot. I mean, just even hundreds of millions of dollars can make an enormous difference. And if Antonia has anything to add.
Yeah, nothing much to add really, other than, from our perspective. So the data that we collected for this particular project, I think ultimately we had something like 60 plus indicators that were indicators of media viability in the 10 countries that we were looking at. And I think it would be really interesting now that we're starting to have more use cases for these types of policies that are coming into play, to be able to see to what extent that those policies are actually impacting that long list of indicators that we pulled together for this particular initiative, and to see if some of those figures that I shared with you earlier that actually has some impact and moves the needle slightly. So I think from our perspective, from the Economist perspective, that would be a really interesting opportunity with some of these test cases to actually see what impact this is having on the overall media viability in those particular countries.
Thank you, Anya. Thank you, Antonia. Martín. Por favor.
Sí, mucho gusto. Martín Echevers desde Argentina. Saludo al amigo Guilherme, que hace mucho que no lo veo, y además felicitar a Antonia y a Anya por sus respectivos informes, que creo que sistematizan y echan mucha luz basada en datos a fenómenos que todos quienes somos parte de esta industria sabemos que existían y que se habían profundizado en la pandemia. Así que muchas gracias por eso. Dos dudas o simplemente dos detalles respecto de los caminos o las propuestas que Anya de alguna manera resumió que están apareciendo en el mundo. Si podés profundizar, Anya, sobre este tax credit de Francia para las suscripciones, si esto ha generado una buena respuesta por parte de la audiencia francesa para suscribirse a los medios, si tenés alguna información sobre eso. Y así como se tocó el tema Australia y el tema Canadá, ¿qué mirada tienen desde la UNESCO de todo lo que fue la Directiva Europea de Copyright de 2018 y todas las leyes que fueron surgiendo a nivel de cada uno de los países de Europa luego de esa directiva? ¿Cómo está funcionando?
Gracias, Martín. Anya?
Sure. I mean, I'm definitely not an expert on French tax credits. I would encourage you to read some of our reports, which has more detail. But I think overall, there's a few things to remember about France. You know, one is that they've been supporting publishing and journalism for decades, and they use many, many, many mechanisms. For example, if you're a bookstore and an independent bookstore in a small town and you want to stock the French classics, you can get a subsidy. If you want to update your website, you can get a subsidy. If you need to fix your roof, you can get a subsidy. So they have like 5 different subsidies for bookshops, for example. They have a lot of funds, and Holland, by the way, has just created an innovation fund for media outlets that want to innovate. So across Europe, there's all kinds of pools of funding. And we just had a conference in New York, actually, on March 25th, where we looked at examples from around the world. Korea, for example, was looking at giving people subscription vouchers. So there's lots of innovation that's happening. And I guess a few things to say. One is there isn't hard data on any of this, and there probably never will be. So I think it's really important not to get too bogged down by the lack of data. You know, it's been so interesting. I interviewed a lot of economists as I was doing my research, and they just said, you know what? We never know why things work. Like the IRA in America, does it work? Do people put money in an IRA for their retirement account because of the tax credit? Do they put money in because knowing there's an IRA reminds them to save for their old age? Like, we don't actually know. So I think that, so a couple sort of broader points about the French tax credits. One is, you know, none of this stuff is going to solve all the problems. Of course, it just helps. It's like, you know, staunching the bleeding. And then the criticism in France is that a lot of these subsidies support outlets that probably should have died anyway. Right. And I think, as you know, with policymaking, one of the big questions is, can you make sure you're not supporting people that shouldn't get support? And I would say the answer is probably not. And it's not the end of the world. So for me, if a couple of old, crusty French magazines that don't have a lot of readers are held up by these supports, it's really not a tragedy, because the greater good is helping is helping the system. The early indications on vouchers suggest that they haven't actually been that effective. So what they've seen in Canada is that, I guess in economist speak, price elasticity is not the most important variable. So it turns out that if the government's giving you $200 a year to subscribe to a newspaper, doesn't seem to encourage more people to subscribe necessarily. They would have subscribed anyway. And I understand what I've learned from Seattle is that when they started giving out vouchers to citizens to subscribe, some bad actors set up, you know, terrible outlets just to get the subscription revenue. So one question we've had a lot in the US is that these big evil hedge funds have bought a lot of our local papers. And so in the journalism community, there's been this debate of like, well, we shouldn't have tax credits because it might go to Alden Capital. If you want more information about Alden Capital, The Atlantic did a cover story in October. But then there's other people who say, you know what, if it makes Alden Capital hire more local reporters, then actually that's a good thing, even if we hate Alden Capital. So those are some of, you know, the debates and the discussions that's having. Again, you might want to someone might want to put in the chat this report we wrote, Saving Journalism Too, because that has a whole section on France. But it's really, yeah, again, there isn't going to be much data. So economists sort of said to me, you've just got to do whatever won't cause harm and what might help. And then, you know, we'll take it from there. So I'm working with Taylor Owen at the McGill Journalism School at the Max Bell School of Public Policy. And we're going to try to spend the summer and the next few years looking at comparative media policy around the world. So if anybody has an idea of a research topic or a case study, I'm always looking for stuff like that. And I would, I'd love to. I mean, I was thinking I would spend the summer looking at vouchers, but it seems already we know they don't work. So I'm not sure I should spend the whole summer working on something that probably isn't working. Tax credits, there's a huge lack of data. So we're probably going to wind up doing lots of sort of interviews and case studies. And just email me at Columbia, acs76@columbia.edu if you have suggestions, because we're super interested in looking in more detail at all of these things. Thank you. Oh, and our next conference on media policy will be October 21st in New York. We're just doing like a small invitation only. We only had 25 people at our last event. But if this is something you're working on and you'd like to come, or you have a solution that you'd like to present, just let me know. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anya. Antonia, do you want to add anything to this?
No, nothing really. Anya summarized it pretty well.
Tengo una pregunta, si me permites.
Ricardo, solo 30 segundos son la historia de los copyright que Martín ha preguntado. De nuevo, es otro tema que tiene muchas aristas. No voy a entrar en los detalles por el tiempo que tenemos, pero solo una cosa que es importante. Desde nuestra perspectiva, uno de los errores de las políticas pasadas sobre estos temas que estamos discutiendo acá fue justamente intentar hacer algo, pero sin una visión estructurada y de largo plazo sobre todo eso. O sea, no estaban mirando el periodismo y la información como un bien público y intentando ver cuál es el mejor o los mejores mecanismos institucionales para resolver un problema que es estructural. Estaban intentando encontrar soluciones ad hoc. Bueno, acá y allá metemos una plata acá en los medios con esta solución de copyright acá o de otros, y eso se verificó que no es suficiente para dar cuenta del problema. Entonces, la posición de la UNESCO en general, sin hablar de ninguna estrategia en particular de este país o de esta región, es justamente esta que estamos publicando en este policy brief. Este tema es un tema enorme. Los estados tienen que reconocer que el periodismo es fundamental para la consolidación democrática y si así es, hay que poner plata en eso y hay que poner plata de una manera estructural, construyendo las salvaguardias necesarias para que ustedes logren hacer su trabajo de manera independiente. Entonces, la posición general de la UNESCO es esta, o sea, hay que mirar esto como un problema estructural. Y por eso cuando comisionamos estos distintos estudios, no estábamos interesados en solamente uno de los ángulos, no solamente incluir esto en los paquetes de recuperación post-COVID, o los vouchers, o los tax credits. Lo que pedimos a la de Economist y a Anya es miremos estas varias cosas, pero siempre con esta perspectiva que estos tienen que ser mirados como bienes públicos y por lo tanto cómo hacer para mantenerlos de esta forma, ¿no? Termino diciendo, para mi sorpresa y felicidad, el año pasado la presidenta de la Comisión Europea, Ursula von der Leyen, publicó una discusión diciendo sí, la Comisión Europea está mirando la información como un bien público. Entonces, eso ya es un señal interesante de que las nuevas regulaciones que vienen, el DSA, el Media Freedom Act, esperemos todos van a tener una mirada más estructural y más amplia de estos problemas. Ricardo.
Sí, una pregunta a Anya y otra a Antonia. Primero, Anya, más tarde vamos a tener a Daniel Coffey de News Media Alliance y nos va a estar hablando de la posibilidad de una ley para negociar el estilo de la de Canadá. Un poco por conocer bien a los legisladores y a los publishers de Estados Unidos, ¿qué chances le ves de que haya una ley parecida a la de Canadá o Australia en Estados Unidos? Primero. Y Antonia, la segunda pregunta es, ustedes ya en Inglaterra, fuera o con parte del Brexit, fuera de la Unión Europea, si en Inglaterra hay algún movimiento de los publishers para también intentar una ley parecida a la de Australia, que es parte, y la de Canadá, siendo que son países del Commonwealth. Gracias.
Anya, you would like to start?
Sorry, I was too busy in the chat. So one of the things that we found in our research is that, I think it's a great shame, but around the world, there's tension between the large outlets and the small outlets. And the reason is small outlets feel like the large ones are getting unfair advantages. So I think it's wonderful that Daniel Coffey is coming to speak from the News Media Alliance. But, you know, many of your like startups in small towns or groups like the Free Press, you know, the NGOs will complain about what they're doing. And by the way, this has happened everywhere. We wrote about this when the German government tried to do a big support package for news outlets in Germany. One of the small ones, Sebastian Esser from Kraut Reporter, said not fair, and they killed the whole package. So I think, you know, one of the things I'm really worried about is how can we find laws and policies that everybody can agree on? And so I think that, you know, when we're thinking about Australia or Canada, to me, there's no reason why we couldn't set aside money to help some of the small outlets. I mean, I've literally, when I was doing my research, one of the small outlets said to me, it's good for us if the big ones die, because then we can get more foundation money, right? So Daniel Coffey, who I think is terrific, represents the sort of, you know, newspaper really kind of lobby industry in this country. So that's what they're pushing really hard. In terms of whether it's going to get passed, I think maybe more likely now than in the past. I think there's, you know, much more of an appetite than before. On the other hand, as you know, we have a really dysfunctional Congress. The person who's a real expert is Steve Waldman. It's unbelievable what he's doing at this point. He's put together a coalition of news outlets across the United States. He has regular briefings. He's like a one-man band. I mean, he's the person who got all the tax credits into Build Back Better. So if you want to, you know, join his group, I absolutely would. The other thing that we're seeing in the US now is because there's so much fear that the big laws won't get passed on a federal level, we're seeing local initiatives. So California right now is looking at a bunch of ways to support journalism. New Jersey actually set up a fund to support investigative journalism and put it into the New Jersey budget because New Jersey is a news desert. I think many of you know Graciela Mochkowski, who was instrumental in getting New York City to fund local news, which I know for people like, you know, I edited 3 volumes on media capture, right? So I know so well the dangers of state advertising. And, you know, my students and I like advised the government of Bhutan 10 years ago, don't do this. But in New York, it's really working. It's astonishing. So we're seeing like a lot of kind of local initiatives that are happening. But I think it's great you've got Danielle speaking. Would love to know more. And then also, as you know, Rosenthal Alves just had the ISOJ, and we had a very interesting panel with Steve Waldman and Dave talking about some of these initiatives around the world. So you could also watch that if you're interested, although I know everybody's sick of Zoom. And then I guess somebody will need to translate the question for Antonia. I think it was really like we did a Zoom last year with a bunch of competition ministers from around the world. And the UK at that time said they did want to copy Australia. And since whereas the Europeans said we'd love to, but we can't, you know, we can't because we're in the EU copyright directive. But Antonia, you probably have more up-to-date information on what the UK is doing. And then the final thing I just wanted to say, and I think this is really important for Latin America, is that at Perugia, there were a lot of discussions about SLAPP lawsuits, which have now really spread. You know, we used to think of this as something that would happen in the Philippines, right? That you would sue to shut down an outlet. It's now become a huge problem. Maria Stragomir has just finished a big body of research on analyzing these lawsuits and who are the beneficiaries. Obviously, it's a huge problem in London, and the EU is just starting the consultative process on their new media freedom law, and they'll be looking at SLAPP suits. By the way, Canada spent a very long time also doing consultations before they did the bargaining code as well. Okay, over to you, Antonia. Thanks, everybody.
So I have to confess, I'm not a policy expert by any stretch of the imagination. So I honestly think, Anya, you know better than me about what's going on in the UK as far as sort of news bargaining codes are concerned. I think actually what's been interesting and is something I've been following pretty closely is more this discussion right now that's going on around the TV licensing fee and the BBC in the UK. So obviously this is something that seems to come up for debate all the time, but I think recently with the Conservative government, there's been a freeze on increase around TV licensing fees and a discussion, I think a more rigorous discussion around what that actually could look like in the future. And if it continues to be, you know, in the exact medium that it exists right now, or if there's a transition at some point to something more similar to what we see in Scandinavia of sort of a public service tax model. And I think I've spoken to a few folks at the BBC actually, and as an organization, it's really sort of in this place of turmoil and who are they going to be in the next 100 years. And what's interesting is, you know, in thinking about some of the new ways that media organizations can exist in the ecosystem we find ourselves in today, there's an increased elevation around this sort of technology and research and development side of the organization, and a focus on how, you know, public service media organization like the BBC could actually maybe compete with, you know, the large tech players as, you know, in terms of creating a public service type internet. So this transition maybe from just being a pure media organization to maybe something that is more of a hybrid model is a really interesting one. And I know it's a conversation that's been going on for a while, but, you know, what kinds of technologies do they need to be investing in order to make them not only competitive with the large, you know, commercial players, but actually to create a viable alternative to what's already in place right now. So I hope that sort of answers the question. But again, I think Anya probably knows more specifically about policy interventions on the bargaining code side.
Guilherme, si podemos ir cerrando ya, te agradezco mucho.
Claro, bueno, tú eres el dueño de esta historia, yo hago lo que tú me ordenes hacer. Mira, es para nosotros, creo, hablo por Anya y por Antonia también, un placer estar en esta discusión, o sea, además de ser un privilegio, porque al fin del día son ustedes dueños de medios, en este caso en el contexto interamericano, que van a tener que también hacer el empuje para que estas discusiones de políticas públicas avancen. Lo que puedo decir desde la UNESCO es sigan contando con nosotros, incluso sigan alertándonos si ven que estas cosas están siendo mal utilizadas. O sea, lo que percibimos mucho en los años de la pandemia es que con la buena intención el discurso oficial era de luchar contra las mal llamadas fake news, etcétera, una cantidad de leyes anti-libertad de expresión fueron aprobadas. Entonces, hay que tener mucho cuidado porque el debate de la viabilidad de los medios es un debate que los gobiernos pueden abrazar en el sentido, vamos a hacer algo positivo, pero por ahí meten cosas que no deberían o que no están en línea con los estándares internacionales, y es creo ahí que la UNESCO puede ayudar mucho en seguir trabajando este tema con nuestros Estados miembros. Si me permite, Ricardo, 2 segundos más antes de pedir a Anya y Antonia que digan sus final remarks, muy breves, y yo solo quisiera reforzar la invitación para el Día Mundial de Libertad de Expresión que tendrá lugar en Punta del Este dentro de 10 días más. Puse ahí en el chat en algún momento el enlace para el registro. El evento va a ser totalmente híbrido y yo sé que muchos de ustedes estarán allá físicamente, lo que será un placer verlos y verlas personalmente, pero si no pueden, todas las sesiones, con excepción de aquellas que son sesiones cerradas para discusiones internas, estarán disponibles en vivo, con la posibilidad de participación activa, hacer preguntas, enviar comentarios, etcétera. Y el tema de este año, como ustedes saben, es periodismo bajo asedio digital. Y uno de los temas exactamente de los desafíos digitales es este de la viabilidad de los medios, pero también vamos a discutir surveillance, vamos a discutir la violencia contra mujeres periodistas en línea, etc. Y la última cosa, Ricardo tiene, y no sé, seguramente ya puede haber enviado a ustedes, nosotros estamos invitando a todos los medios en todo el mundo a sumarse a la campaña que la UNESCO está publicando este año, que normalmente lo hacemos en el 3 de mayo. Les cuento que de los grandes diarios internacionales, el New York Times, el Los Angeles Times, el The Guardian, ya aceptaron y el 3 de mayo van todos a publicar este aviso que es sobre eso, ¿no? Sobre el periodismo bajo asedio digital. Así que Ricardo tiene las cosas en inglés, español, portugués, y podrá enviar a los diarios de ustedes si están interesados en publicar esta campaña en el 3 de mayo, como todos lo harán. De mi parte, un gustazo haber también moderado mis queridas amigas Anya y Antonia, pero Anya, Antonia, paso a ustedes, I get the floor back to you, 2 seconds each for goodbyes for this incredible audience. Anya.
Nada, solo quiero decir que es un honor estar con ustedes, que estoy muy agradecida a la oportunidad y todas las preguntas tan interesantes. Y también siento muy optimística porque todos estamos pensando en estas cosas tan importantes para el futuro, no solo de periodismo, sino también para democracia. Bueno, muchísimas gracias y espero que nos vemos pronto.
Antonia.
I just wanted to say thank you as well to everyone here. It's been such a pleasure and an honor to speak with all of you. And I think really my main call to action is just, you know, as Anya said, there's a lot of optimism. And I think right now we have the evidence that shows that, you know, we need to move quickly, we need to move together, we need to move now in order to be able to preserve, you know, journalism, freedom of expression, and as Anya said, democracy itself. So I think there's a really, really strong call to action for all of us on this call right now.
Muchas gracias.